Getting bigger by being better.
The number one choice for Bristol.
This is BCFM
93.2.
And we change the subject now to look at the Westminster Bridge attack a couple of weeks ago, and I'm joined on the line by someone who made a film. He's from London, Alan Buttle. Hi, Alan. Welcome to the Politics Show.
Hi, Tony. Thanks for having me.
First of all, just tell us a bit about why you decided to actually get down on your computer and make a little film about this and stick it on YouTube.
Well, I just think there's such little proper investigative journalism happening in the mainstream media, and I think we just need as many people as possible sort of going through all the details sort of with a fine-tooth comb and trying to find the inconsistencies in the story, because the mainstream media do an atrocious job at resolving these inconsistencies.
Was there anything particularly that you saw about the way that this was covered where you thought, I just don't believe that? Quite a lot of people do things like throw things at the television, switch it off. What was the one thing for you, if there was one?
Well, whenever I see an event like this that gets such saturated media coverage from the very start, I ask questions straight away, because we've seen with previous false flag attacks like 9/11, for example, being the most famous, all the media are ready to tell the same story straight away. So, and it saturates the entire media. There's nothing else in the news, and this was the case with Westminster. And so I was intrigued at the outset, and then sort of analysed the evidence as it started to come in.
Well, OK, I asked you that question because I'm also going to ask the same question of myself, and maybe Martin too, because for me it was a report on the BBC, live report. One of the first reporters to the scene for BBC television was Daniel Sandford, and here's that report, because this was almost one of the first things that anyone who switched on the TV that day would have seen. But some of the things that were being said I found really quite surprising. Anyway, let's have a little listen to this report now from Daniel Sandford on the day.
Well, we're starting to get a picture of what may have happened from talking to eyewitnesses here at Scotland Yard, which is only 100 metres from the heart of the incident. It sounds as if a vehicle drove over Westminster Bridge at high speed, knocking people down. We've had eyewitnesses describing to us possibly 8 people lying on Westminster Bridge. Somebody somehow ended up actually in the River Thames itself, possibly as part of that incident. The vehicle then seems to have run itself up against the Palace of Westminster, and we're hearing reports of 2 different possible assailants. One has been described to me by eyewitnesses as a white person, possibly with bald hair, carrying what looked to be 2 large knives. And a second one, which seems to be the man being arrested by police in Old Palace Yard, appears to be a black man with a goatee beard. And talking to police officers around here, there does seem to be a feeling that there may have been 2 people in the vehicle. So a possible, and I stress at this stage, a possible picture of a vehicle with 2 people in it, one black, one white, mowing people down on Westminster Bridge, and then people inside then trying to get inside the Palace of Westminster itself.
Well, that could be just maybe spurious eyewitness coming along saying something which simply isn't true. But Daniel Sandford there actually does say that even the police were saying it looked like that there were 2 suspects. One was a white bald man, another one black man with a goatee beard, both in the car. Now, this is a little bit not what we've been told, Martin, is it?
No, it isn't. And of course, what people would say, well, there must be CCTV, somebody must have checked up on it, we now know what happened. But we know what happens in previous incidents like this. A media narrative is established, and then everybody sings from the same hymn sheet. So on 7/7, for example, Mark Holningsbaum, who's a Guardian journalist, started reporting outside Edgware Road, I think, and he said what people were saying, that the bombs were under the trains, that the train was derailed by a bomb underneath it. Then, of course, later on it was all about rucksack bombs, etc. Now, because we know that the NATO intelligence services do engage in false flag terrorism, like the Bologna bombing in 1980 or the Piazza Fontana bombing in 1969 in Milan. We know that they do these things. So the first question has always got to be in an incident like this, is this for real or is this a false flag? And that's a perfectly legitimate question.
So the question is, whatever happened to Bald White Man? Or was he just some sort of ghost figment of the
Well, he might have been the handler for the other chap.
Yeah, and was he actually the driver of the car,
Well,
potentially?
we don't know, do we?
Now, this really leads me to for me, which is the key point, which is this new shoot-to-kill policy, it seems, that we've got in Britain. Like Yasser Yaqub, he was the guy who was shot on the M62 on the 2nd of January. His driver, Moshin Amin, is actually standing trial for possession of a firearm. It doesn't look, certainly on the evidence at the moment, that Yasser Yaqub actually even was armed, personally armed himself, and yet he was shot dead by the police on the scene. The same exact thing has happened in the Westminster attacks. Alan, do you want to run through some of the things that you think have stood out in your analysis that you think haven't been properly reported?
Right, well, basically we're dealing with an event that should have a great deal of evidence, obviously happening right outside the Houses of Parliament in the middle of the day. Normally tourist cameras are already trained on Parliament, so you would expect many people to gather footage and upload it to the internet, but actually we have none at all. The only video that's been taken that shows the aftermath taken from the bridge is by the ex-Polish Defence Secretary, Radoslaw Sikorski. So that's a very ominous...
Yeah, and you quite rightly pointed out that he's also a former Bullingdon Club member.
That's right, yes, alongside David Cameron and Boris Johnson, of course. So, you know, we wouldn't necessarily trust him from the outset. And many of the eyewitnesses gave very differing accounts. There were 2 women that said on film that they saw people getting shot on Westminster Bridge, and there were other reports of a policeman tally with the official story that comes out afterwards. We've also got the matter of the photographers that managed to capture the very crystal clear photos of the event for the newspapers.
Well, I've got a little clip actually now about that you did as part of your film, and if you could just manage to find a little bit slightly better mobile coverage, because you've been dropping out there, Alan. In the meantime, I'll just play a little clip from the film that which you put up online, which does talk about these various the interesting photographers that were there.
Now I'll introduce you to the photographers of this event. Toby Melville won the Reuters Photographer of the Year in 2010. If you search for his name, you will find hundreds of photos that he has taken for the mainstream media. He also just happened to be there in exactly the right place to take photos for the newspapers at the Westminster terror attack. His photos are mostly situated on the bridge. These 2 photographs of Toby Melville's are particularly interesting. They seem to show a dead body under a bus, but the body doesn't seem to fit with the story that has just been run over. There is no blood, no visible injuries, and the body shape seems wrong if we're supposed to believe this person had just been run over by a bus which weighs over 12 tons. Also, where are the people around this body? Had they already given up this person for dead? Why isn't anyone trying to help? There was enough time for Melville to take 2 photos from different angles, one of them seeming to show a policeman walking right past unbothered. This is the other main photographer of the event, Stéphane Rousseau. Another photographer, Carl Court, Guardian Photographer of the Year 2016, was right there to take some more photos from the bridge. To have these photographers ready right at the very moment of this event seems to be more than a coincidence, especially when you consider that hardly any other photographs of the event exist other than taken by these photographers. We should have learned by now that the government and the corporate media are compromised. They are dominated by the kind of interests that demand more globalisation, more war, and less human freedom. We have to ask ourselves what the evidence is for this event, and currently we are expected to believe it based only upon a few quite varied eyewitness accounts, a few really unclear, inconclusive videos, and the words of some official and corporate media talking heads. This is not good enough. We need to remain sceptical until there is sufficient evidence in front of us, until we can resolve all the inconsistencies. Until then, we have to keep in mind that it could be very different from how it is being reported. We need to keep open-minded to all possibilities until we can prove that they are impossible. It's also worth mentioning, I think, that this latest attack involving a motor vehicle comes after similar supposed attacks in Nice, Berlin and Jerusalem. The official stories of these events also don't stand up to serious scrutiny, so we have to also conclude that there is a reason why they have chosen to have vehicles play a part in many of the recent attacks, likely because eventually they will want to automise all motor vehicles, which will enable them to gain further control and gather more information about us.
Well, to a certain extent, these vehicles do seem to almost drive themselves sometimes. I mean, we were reading recently about the Mercedes of Michael Hastings that was sped up to 80 miles an hour and crashed over in the United States. But Alan, I mean, at the end of the day, surely the biggest thing here is that we're not going to have a court case now this guy has been shot dead.
Yeah, that's right. And yeah, as you correctly state, this is becoming routine, and I think we have become used to it from what we've seen happening in the United States, where there's often a lone suspect that ends up getting killed by the authorities before they can be put on trial. It's very convenient.
Well, it also reflects what happened to Jean-Charles de Menezes, the electrician that was shot dead, executed, some say, on a tube train by the police just after the 7/7 London bombings too.
That's right, yeah. And the person in charge of that operation, Cressida Dick, now is the head of the Met. So, you know, it didn't do her career too much harm.
Now, I know, Martin, you're actually quite a supporter of the whole shoot-to-kill policy, aren't you?
Well, what I would say is that once you actually open fire, you don't shoot to wound. Nobody does. You shoot to kill.
But what about with the taser, for example?
Well, the taser's supposedly not to kill anybody anyway.
Oh, well, can you not shoot somebody to bring them down rather than to kill them?
You can, but once you
don't have to shoot somebody in the chest, do you?
Well, I would just put it to you this way: people who are trained to use firearms always shoot to kill. There's still a question about all the questions about this still remain to be answered. For example, he was still alive when he was taken to the hospital. Yeah, so he died. He didn't die immediately anyway, even though he was shot to kill.
The other thing, of course, it does when you kill a suspect, whether it's Menezes, Yasser Yaqub, or this chap in the Westminster attacks, is that the media have then got carte blanche to say absolutely anything they want about him, because otherwise they've got to be quite careful, because they may then get sued. Once he's dead, he can't sue them for libel. They can make up anything about him at all, whether it's true or not, and they don't have any kind of legal problems.
I think what people find difficult to understand is why people would kill themselves or allow themselves to be killed carrying out these attacks. They must be genuine. Now, in actual fact, I believe that the Islamist networks in which these individuals are radicalised are actually being run by the intelligence services. We've seen this before. The Red Brigades were infiltrated by the intelligence services, and the so-called Red Brigades kidnapped the Prime Minister of Italy, Aldo Moro, and executed him, although in actual fact subsequent investigation by the police, including Imposimato, the head of the Italian Supreme Court, showed that it was in fact NATO intelligence services.
But he wasn't an Islamic terrorist, was he?
No, but the point I'm making is this, is that when we see Islamist terrorists carrying out these acts, if that's what they are, they themselves may be puppets of the intelligence services, whether they realise it or not. And that is the fundamental way in which NATO false flags have been working for 30 or 40
and of course,
years. The
men...
evidence of the past tells against the future.
Sorry, Alan.
Yeah, I mean, this Khalid Massoud, he was known to go on large drug and sex binges and this kind of thing, for example. So he was definitely not living a pure Islamist lifestyle.
No, he was also known as a violent criminal, of extremely violent chap.
Absolutely, and one that has had contact with the authorities before and that have followed him before. He seems like the perfect kind of guy to recruit to go through with one of these kind of things. That would be my estimation. He seems far more likely to be a police informant recruit than an Islamic fundamentalist terrorist.
There's another couple of aspects to this. One is the lack of an armed police actually on the outside gates of Parliament, and the other is the lack of CCTV coverage. Well, the armed police were dropped from parliamentary duties in January this year. There are two reasons have been given for that, which always makes me a bit suspicious when people can't get their story straight. There are two reasons. One is because the police were too exposed on the gates of Parliament. Well, that is really laughable, because if you're going to use that argument, then you will take all armed guards off of all army bases, air Air Force bases and naval bases as well. And then also the other reason given was that the MPs just felt intimidated by them. So no one seems to be able to get their story straight on why the police were removed 2 months ago. I imagine they're back now, but that was very convenient because it allowed Mahood to get into that area without being challenged with a firearm if he had knives on him, etc. Also, the Westminster CCTV was switched off in June last year, apparently due to lack of funds, although Westminster Council is one of the richest in the country.
Yeah, it's completely laughable. There's just no way, Westminster would switch off their CCTV cameras to save a few, save £5 or something when, the whole place is full of billionaires. It's a complete joke. I agree with you completely. It seems like they removed the armed police from that point in order to have, cover your excuses already before, in preparation of conducting this staged event. It
does look like it, potentially. Anyway, look, also Simon Israel on Channel 4 News, the Channel 4 News' MI5 correspondent, he wrongly named Abu Izzadeen as the terrorist. So it does look as if certainly, there's certain disinformation, untrustworthy, coming from the security services. Martin, it does seem that there's a lot of very, very close relations between the security service and journalists. We've heard this from Annie Mashon, where actually what they do is they simply place their own stories in the press as if the news people are making those stories up themselves. And if you don't cooperate as a senior London media journalist with MI5, you find that you don't get any stories and you might even lose your job.
Well, there's the German chap, wasn't there, who was died recently, who said, well, I worked for the CIA for years and years and years, and I'm not the only one. And
he was working for a national German newspaper, the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung.
Yeah, I mean, unless you can control the narrative after events like this, there's no point the intelligence services running these false flags.
We also heard, of course, that Mahood was a lone wolf. That was said for the first few days, and yet there were a whole load of arrests of his associates in Birmingham.
Well, yes, I mean, whenever these incidents happen, it's obviously going to take a while for anybody to find out what has actually happened, a bit like this chemical weapons attack we were discussing earlier in the show. But I come back to my fundamental point, which is we have documentary evidence from the Italian Supreme Court and from the Irish Supreme Court, for example, that NATO intelligence services do indeed engage in false flag terrorism. And I mentioned Bologna railway station bomb in 1980, killed 86 people. I think anybody who investigates that now knows that the Italian police have proved beyond any doubt that NATO were behind that attack.
But this, Martin, is London. This is not Bologna, is it?
No, but Bologna is part of NATO.
And that was a long time ago.
No, but that's the point I'm making, Tony. It's such a long time ago, and that therefore we know that that's what they were doing in 1980. Why do we presume in 2017 that they've stopped doing these things? Also, and I would say that we don't. And in actual fact, the presumption has got to be that they still are.
Khalid Massoud, we were looking for his connections around the world as well, and found that he had no connections with Iran, Syria or Iraq or anywhere like that. No, it was all connected with Saudi Arabia. He had been over there teaching several times.
Yes, indeed. And the Saudis, of course, are the biggest funders of terrorism of the Salafi jihadi kind in the world. And they worked very closely with the British intelligence services and special forces in the 1980s. And then, of course, they went wild and carried out an attack on 9/11. And we suddenly realised that we shouldn't have been helping these people. But in actual fact, I think we were helping them then. We're still helping them now. I'll bet you the SAS are training jihadis in Jordan as we speak, paid for by our taxes.
Not in Iran, then?
Well, the name is inside Iran as well, but of course the Iranians are pretty aware that's a danger, and they're pretty vigilant about it.
Okay. Also, just to give other points of view, someone who was also I was quite surprised to see on the scene as this was happening, whilst the ambulances were still taking people away from the scene, was the former EDL chap Tommy Robinson. So let's have a listen to what Tommy had to say from the scene of the attack at Westminster Bridge a couple of weeks ago.
I know it's probably not the right time or place. People are probably lying there dying. Yeah? We've had 12 jihad attacks, 12 terrorist attacks stopped last year. When will the general public wake up to understand we're in war? The enemy are in our country, and you're inviting more of them. You want more of them. You want them to have more power. You want to stop people's ability to criticise and speak up. When are you going to realise that? When will the politicians realise that? This is just what people have been waiting for. Look in the background. It's only a matter of time. There were 4 terrorist attacks last year, or planned last week in Paris, in France. Just 4 last week. 4 last week. You don't even hear about it anymore. At no point should any of us, in any of our Western countries, in anywhere in Europe, be putting up with this backward jihad by barbarians that have been imported by our politicians. Imported and protected. And again, for Sky News, we're reporting an Asian. He wasn't an Asian, he's a Muslim on a jihad. I don't know the facts. Obviously, it takes a while for all the facts to come out in an instant like this, but what we know is a 4x4 was driving along the bridge, mowing down people. I've heard there's a possibility 3 are dead, up to 12 are injured. He then ploughed into the Houses of Parliament, and I believe he was shot. He got out with a machete or a knife. And this is it. Guaranteed already, yeah? The facts will come out, but the facts will be that this man was known to our intelligence services. The facts will be that the warnings have been there on this individual. Now, when we're at war, you need to intern the people who are at war with us, who you know are at war with us, rather than waiting them to commit acts of terrorism like this, waiting them for going to murder innocent British people in the streets of our capital city like this.
Well, it's the voice of former EDL lead Tommy Robinson there, actually at the scene at the Westminster Attacks 2 weeks ago.
What a coincidence, because he is former EDL leader, because he went to the Quilliam Foundation, who are, again, an intelligence service front to my mind, and then he rescinded his previous views and he became a moderate voice.
Look, what about the points he's making? He's making
well, he may very well be right. It may very well be the case that these people were on the radar of the intelligence services, and that what I have to say to Tommy, it's because the intelligence services are running the Islamic Jihad in Syria and elsewhere, just as they were running the loyalist terror campaign in Northern Ireland.
He's saying there's a war on. Surely we have to respond to that.
Well, indeed, we have to respond to that because the intelligence services are killing us, using jihadis and using right-wing terrorists. They're trying to create a strategy of tension. And maybe, if the IRA was still operating, the way to deal with people like Tommy with his extreme views is to take the war to Tommy. But I don't approve of that.
Anyway, Alan, you were
war.
trying to speak there.
Yeah, I mean, I think Tommy Robinson's a plant. I think he's there to stir up racial division and to distract people from actually looking into the specific details of the event. He always recites the official story of the event as if it's true, and then takes that and then furthers his own agenda.
Well, perhaps it is true. Perhaps it is true.
Well, I don't think he knows that it's true. I don't think we've seen the evidence to suggest that it's true. And I think that his point about that this guy was known to the police. Well, this is something that they do with many of these staged events. They make that a part of the story, so then people afterwards are crying out for more money for the intelligence agencies. Because, if we could have tracked one more person, then we might have stopped the terrorist event.
Well, look, one of the main aspects of this, one of the fascinating things for me, you talking about the details, you're absolutely right. This is what will convict people if in court or not, if they are still alive at the end of the day, to actually say what had happened in the run-up to an attack, as Khalid Massoud is not, then is the 2 clean knives which were photographed on the floor. I just looked at that and I thought this is very much like the IDF Israeli Defence Force murder of Abdul Fattah al-Sharif in Hebron in March last year. The Israeli Defence Force Sergeant Elor Azaria is now serving an 18-month sentence for that murder, which seems a very lenient sentence for murder, 18 months. But anyway, it looks like he might get out early for it. So what do you make of the appearance of these knives with no blood on them, seem perfectly clean, sort of just dropped on the floor near the body of the so-called terrorist?
Well, again, it's just these little details that on their own don't really prove anything, but when you've got a lot of them, it's hard to explain away the coincidence. That we're expected to believe a lot of coincidences with this event. I mean, to be honest, there isn't even the evidence that any car drove down hitting people that would stand up in a court of law. There's no video. Most of the eyewitness testimonies don't say that they saw a car at all. They're just, the level of the level of scrutiny that the mainstream media gets up to is nothing compared to what would have to pass in in a court of law.
And what about the initial reports of these two people in the car? That seems to have just been completely forgotten about, and of course it won't be looked at in court.
Well, like the Oklahoma City bombing. You know, there were reports of two, and then suddenly it was one, and then the story was one, and that was it. It's happened before.
Also, this attack was claimed by ISIS, apparently, but that's a very strange thing in itself, because you have two news agencies. I think it's called AXA, one of them, and I'll put a link to this on our show page, and the other one is Site News Agency, and ISIS have actually, over the years, distanced themselves from both news agencies, saying, well, quite a lot of the things that these news agencies are putting out has nothing to do with us, and yet, when that news agency claims an attack for ISIS, immediately it goes all the way around the world that it's an ISIS attack.
Well, I mean, Site are a very odd organisation anyway. That's run by Rita Katz, isn't it?
Indeed.
They were broadcasting the beheading videos of James Wright Foley and Stephen Sotloff, and though when there was this propaganda campaign of these fake beheading videos, and Site were the ones that were releasing these videos even before ISIS had.
Alan, I just wondered if you could just give us and our listeners some tips on when there is some kind of terrorist event, and we've had several this week, particularly here on the home territory, how you can try and assess it. You know, how do you know whether something is the way we're being told by the BBC, by ITN, by Channel 4, by Sky, or not?
Well, I just think we should judge everything based on the evidence that we can see, because I think we've seen over many, many decades that the mainstream media, especially, you know, becoming more extreme to the current day, is untrustworthy, and they will lie as a matter of course, and so we have to be our own detectives and come to our own conclusions. And thankfully, there are a lot of very, very good independent journalists out there doing the job that the mainstream media should be doing. But one thing I look for straight away is saturated media coverage, because if they're going to stage an event and they've got the media on board, the whole point of the event is to get that message across in the media as big as possible and as powerfully as possible to the people. So for any of the staged events, you would expect to see saturated media footage, even if the event doesn't seem to warrant it. Like, for example, it didn't kill that many people, you would still see saturated coverage. It could well be a staged event.
OK, Alan, well, you're just dropping out a little bit there. But anyway, look, thanks ever so much for joining us here on the Politics Show. And I'll put a link up to your video on our show page at thisweek.org.uk.
Thanks a lot, Tony. It's been a pleasure.
Made in Bristol. This is BCFM
93.2.
So, Martin, what was your... I mean, I should really ask you the same thing. What's your tip for, I suppose, reading between the lines, getting through the propaganda, that kind of thing?
Well, obviously, start with a sceptical attitude. That would be my fundamental point. You know, you saw Tommy Robinson there going on about jihadis and this, that and the other. He's got no historical knowledge at all. The fact is that NATO intelligence services over many years have engaged in false flag terrorism. It's proven. The Italian police have proven it. Imposimato, the head of the Italian Supreme Court, wrote a book that came out in 2012, La Repubblica dei Stragi Impuni, the Republic of the Unpunished Massacres, and which showed beyond any doubt that NATO does engage in these kind of terrorist attacks. So the first thing you've got to say is, when an attack like this happens, is it a false flag attack? And of course they've been working very closely with jihadis, particularly of a Saudi orientation, since the 1980s. So that's for 30, 40 years. And why isn't it that they don't catch these people? It's because they're working for the intelligence service.
Well, I can tell you one thing, is there's a certain amount of confusion over whether it's possible to present lies as fact, the truth, etc. And it does seem as if there's quite a lot of stuff coming through the mainstream media nowadays where we're basically just being told what to believe without actually being shown both sides, but without any balance. One of the people who's been looking into this kind of postmodern situation is the Indian writer Ravi Zacharias.